Good evening and welcome to our weekly Bible study. We are going to start the book of Numbers tonight, so let's pray and get started. Heavenly Father, we always thank you that you allow us to study your word. What a privilege it is, and help us never to take that for granted. Father, I just pray your blessings on believers in other countries that literally risk their lives to study your word. Father, help us to have hearts of compassion for them and to pray for them. Lord, and help us to take advantage of the privileges that we have. Father, I thank you for this lesson tonight. I thank you that you teach us that you're serious about our service to you. I thank you that you teach us that you're there to lead us and that we should follow you faithfully and obediently. So, Father, just take this lesson tonight as we study it and as we delve into this book that we often just kind of neglect, that you help us to learn the lessons that you want us to. We pray these things in Jesus' precious holy name. Amen. We normally just kind of skip over some of these books in the Bible. Leviticus is one of them. Numbers is one of them. Deuteronomy is usually one of them. We just kind of like, there's just really not anything in there I need. But that's not true. So tonight we are going to begin our study of Numbers. We finished Psalms last week, and we are going to begin Numbers this week. We only have 7 sessions to cover 36 chapters of Numbers. And then we're going to have 6 sessions where we're going to cover 34 chapters of Deuteronomy. That's not really possible, but the chapters that we skip, I will go back and just give you a very brief scenario or brief just covering what they left out, because I think when we study a book, we need to actually study the whole book. I could not do that in Psalms. There were 150 Psalms. There's no way that you can do that with Psalms, but Psalms you can kind of pick apart. Numbers is a continuous book. It's part of at least it's part of the Bible that is actually in a chronological order. And so as we study it, I will try to fill in some of the missing parts just very briefly. So this week is going to be the introduction, and then I'll kind of fly through chapters 1 through 8, and then our study is just a few verses out of chapter 9. So the introduction is actually longer than what our materials in the study was for this week. The book of Numbers is the 4th of 5 books that are credited to Moses. We call these the books of the law. Numbers gets its name from the Latin translation of the book. The Latin name for it was numeri, which is where we get our word for number. The Greek translation of it was arithmoi, which is where we get our word for arithmetic. So both of those translations dealing with numbers. There are other accounts of the book that refer to it as the books of journeyings or the book of wanderings, which is really more what it's about. Because what should have been a very short trip took them 40 years. In Deuteronomy, it tells us that a journey from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, which was the border of the land of Israel, was about a 2-week journey. Now, maybe not for this large group of people, but for someone it would be about a 2-week journey. It was about 150 to 200 miles, depending on the route that you took. The wanderings take place mostly in the wilderness of Sinai on the Sinai Peninsula. I have been to the Sinai Peninsula. I'll just tell you, I would not want to be wandering around on the Sinai Peninsula. It's just not, I'm sure maybe it was different, somewhat different at least, that many centuries, actually millennia ago, but not a good place to just be out wandering around, not now, and I really don't think it was your choice of places then. It rises at its highest peak about 2,500 feet above sea level. and it does it quickly. The mountains on the Sinai Peninsula are kind of rugged and they just jut up. So if you were going to cross some of those, it could be a little hard. Regardless of what the TV programs tell you, their scholars are not absolutely sure where Sinai was. The location, there are two main frames of thought on where the location of Sinai was, one a little bit more to the north, one a little bit more to the south. The main place that they will take you on as a tour is what is kind of traditionally accepted as the one that is Mount Sinai, and I believe it's the more southern location. There are three peaks there. One is Horeb, or supposedly Horeb, and then one of the other main one is Sinai. The main reason, though, that Numbers, the book of Numbers, is called the book of Numbers is because there are two times in the book of Numbers a census is taken, in chapter 1 and then again in chapter 26. These two countings of the Israelites are literally 38 years and 10 months apart. The second census, there's actually a smaller number than there was in the first census, at least of the ones that were counted. There's actually a smaller number by about 1,800 people, smaller. But remember, the one generation that left, the generation that left Egypt had to die in the wilderness. So when the book of Numbers begins, chapter 1, and the book of Numbers begins, the Israelites are camped in the desert of Sinai, on the Sinai Peninsula. They have received the 10 Commandments prior to this. They've already been given. The tabernacle has been completed. We completed the tabernacle in the end of Exodus, Exodus chapter 40, but it's not in use yet. And when we begin chapter 1 of Numbers, it is the first day of the second month of the second year that they left Egypt. So God tells Moses at this time to take a census of Israel. He tells them to count them by clans and by families, and to list the name of every man one by one that was aged 20 years old or older and was able to serve in the army. So one man from each tribe was appointed to help Moses and Aaron take this census. I am not going to bore you with the numbers. It literally gives Reuben has 48,500. Judah has 74,600. I'm not going to make you listen to all of those. I will look over these and tell you that Benjamin was the smallest tribe with 35,400, and Judah was the largest tribe with 74,600. But the grand total of the census and this was the two sons of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim, and the 10 tribes, not counting the Levites, because the Levites were not given allotments of land. Their job was to take care of the tabernacle and then later the temple. So they are not counted in this census. We will take a census of them in a minute, but it's not counted in this census, which was a census of the fighting men. So the grand total of these 12 tribes, because there are two tribes of Joseph, which were Manasseh and Ephraim, and then not counted in this is the tribe of Levi. So, excuse me, there were a grand total of 603,550,000 fighting men. 603,550 fighting men. And so the Levites, like I said, were not counted because they served in the tabernacle. They were the ones that were responsible for moving the tabernacle, for keeping everything the way God had commanded in the tabernacle. And so they were not a part of this, basically the standing army that was counted here. Chapter 2 gives us instructions of how the Israelites were to camp. They would be organized around the tabernacle. The tabernacle was the center of everything. They were to be organized around the tabernacle. And God laid out literally which 4 tribes would be on the north side of the tabernacle, which 4 tribes would be on the south side, which 4 tribes would be on the west side, and which 4 tribes would be on the east side of the tabernacle. There is one interesting fact that I do want to point out about where the tribes were located. And I think this is just a glimpse of Jesus in the Old Testament. The tribe of Judah was located on the east side of the tabernacle. The only entrance into the tabernacle was from the east. Our quartet used to sing a song that talked about the eastern gate. That was the only the only entrance into the tabernacle. God's presence was in the tabernacle. God's presence was above the mercy seat, where the wings of the cherubim met above the mercy seat. That is where God's presence was. That's where he talked to Moses from. And so think about this. The only entrance into the presence of God, eventually, entrance into the east side of the tabernacle and then eventually into the presence of God, was from the east. Judah, the tribe of Judah, was encamped on the east. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. Jesus is our only way into the presence of God. So that's just, I think, a manifestation of Jesus in the Old Testament. Chapter 3 talks about the Levites. It starts out by talking about Aaron and his sons, and it lists Aaron's 4 sons, and then it reminds us that back in Exodus, his 2 oldest sons had been killed by the Lord. They had offered unholy or unauthorized offering. I think it called it unholy fire. There's speculation on what they did. There had been such specific instructions given on, for example, how the incense in the room outside of the Holy of Holies. Aaron was the only one allowed in the Holy of Holies. But outside of the Holy of Holies, there was an incense table, and there were specific instructions on how there had to be a live coal taken from the from the altar, the brass altar that was out there where sacrifices were made, and that live coal was taken in and used to light the incense on the incense altar. And so there's speculation that they said, why do we have to go all the way out there and get that? Here's a coal. Here, I'll just take it and do it. We don't know for sure. We're not told, but we are told how serious God is about obeying his instructions when it comes to that taking care of the tabernacle, lighting of the incense, how the lampstands were supposed to be, everything. And these 2 older sons did something that was against what God had told them, how God had told them to do that. And so they were killed on the spot. So the 2 younger of Aaron's sons are left, and they will help their father, and that is Nadab and Abihu. So God was absolutely serious about the service of his priests. I said Nadab and Abihu, those are the 2 older sons that were killed. The 2 younger sons were Eleazar and Ithamar that were left to serve with Aaron. The Lord told Moses, he says, I have taken the Levites, and the Levites are in the place of the firstborn males of all of the tribes. And then the Lord tells Moses to count the Levites. And he says, but this time, instead of males 20 years of age and older that are able to serve in the army, he says, count every male that is 1 month old, that is firstborn, every firstborn male that is at least 1 month old. And there were 22, no, not firstborns, this was all of the Levites, and there were 22,000 of them. That's going to be an interesting number here in just a minute. Then the Lord told him to count all of the firstborn males of all the tribes. So count all of the males, 1 month and older, of the Levites, and there are 22,000. Now count all of the firstborn males in all of the tribes. Remember, God required the firstborn of the animals, the firstborn in Egypt, the firstborn. He took the Egyptian firstborn when the night of Passover, but there could be a sacrifice of an unblemished lamb and the blood put over the doorposts, and the firstborn son of the humans, of the people, would be saved. And so this is what the Lord is saying. Count all of the firstborn males in all of the tribes, and I will take the Levites into my service in place of these firstborn males in every tribe. And you know how many there were? 22,273. You think God already knew those numbers? And then for the 273, he told them that they would need to pay 5 shekels of silver to the tabernacle for the ones that were not covered by the Levites. And then in chapter 4, the Lord assigns detailed responsibilities to the clans and the families of the Levites. For example, he says the men that are age 30 to 50 of the clan of the Kohathites, which was one of the sons of the Levites, they are to care for the most holy things. They would be in charge of packing them up, taking down the curtains like to the Holy of Holies. Now, Aaron, the high priest, was the only one that could go in and cover the Ark of the Covenant. Then after he had covered it, then these Kohathites could come in, only pick it up by the poles that were through the gold rings on the sides, but they could transport it that way. So every family, every tribe had very specific and detailed responsibilities for setting up and breaking down the tabernacle, because this tabernacle was mobile. And when they moved throughout that 40 years through the wilderness, they had to break it down. And as soon as they got somewhere, they had to set it back up. And so every clan, every family, every person had a specific responsibility, and every single responsibility was important, because when they got to the new place, if someone did not fulfill their responsibility, then the tabernacle would not be complete. So it was very important. So just as detailed as God had been about the creation of everything in and the tabernacle itself, he is very detailed in how and who would be responsible for taking it down and transporting it. And then chapter 5 is about keeping the camp healthy. There were rules about if someone had a skin disease or any kind of thing that would probably be considered contagious, would make them unclean. And they were made to go outside the camp. They had to stay outside the camp until a priest declared them clean again. That was to protect them from the spread of disease, the spread of things. And then also there were instructions in there about restoration. If someone does another Israelite wrong, it would be judged, and they would have to make restoration. Unfaithfulness, and it specifically talked about a jealous husband and unfaithful wife, some things like that. Then chapter 6 dealt with the Nazirite vow. I'm not going to get into that, but an Israelite could take a vow for a very long time, literally for their lifetime, all the way down to a very short vow if they had a reason that they wanted to take a vow before the Lord, and it gave all the requirements of that vow. And then in chapter 7, Moses anoints and consecrates the temple, and they have not the temple, but the tabernacle, and they have basically a tabernacle dedication. The tribes at that time bring their offerings to the tabernacle, and they brought offerings of gold and silver and of carts and oxen and goats and sheep and just all kinds of things. And so this was evidently a 12-day long thing, because each tribe brought their things. And so this is the dedication the tabernacle has been finished, it has been set up, and now it's the offerings and everything have been brought into the tabernacle, and it's been dedicated and it's ready for use. And then chapter 8 is instructions for making the Levites ceremonially clean. That is a hard word for me to pronounce. So that they can begin service. How they were supposed to wash, how they were supposed to shave their entire bodies, how they would have water sprinkled on them for a ceremony of that cleansing, and then how some of them would be dressed, the whole thing. And then they would be ready to start serving. So the tabernacle could be up and running. The tabernacle is ready to be used. The Levites are ready to begin serving. So their mobile, transportable worship center was up and running. And then we go into, that was chapter 8, and then we go into the first part of chapter 9, which is where our lesson is actually going to be tonight. And chapter 9, verses 1 through 14, is where the Lord tells Moses to have the Israelites celebrate Passover. This will be their first actual celebration after they exited the land of Egypt. And he says, at the appointed time, which was twilight on the 14th day of the first month, he said, I want you to celebrate Passover. And of course, that would reiterate to them how the Passover had taken place in Egypt. And so that gets us to where our lesson begins. And our lesson's very short. And we are going to read Numbers chapter 9, verses 15 and 16. On the day the tabernacle, the tent of covenant law, was set up, the cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. That is how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night it looked like fire. So this is the presence of God with the people of Israel. God had literally, audibly talked to Moses. He had talked to him in the burning bush way back early on. He had talked to him on Mount Sinai. And then here we see that he talks to Moses from the mercy seat of the ark. And so this cloud that covers, on that day that they dedicated the tabernacle, this cloud that covers the tabernacle is evidence to the people of God's presence with them. If you remember back when Moses was about to go up the mountain, God spoke to the people. He said, gather the people here around the base of the mountain. And God spoke to the people, and it scared them to death. It absolutely scared them to death. And they told Moses, they said, you go meet with God and you just come back and tell us what he says. We don't want to hear from God anymore. That scared us. And so from that point on, God did speak to Moses, not to the people. And he spoke to Moses once the temple was consecrated from the mercy seat, from above the mercy seat, where the wings of the cherubim met over that mercy seat on the ark in the Holy of Holies. But God's presence was literally visible to the people, to the Israelite people, the entire time that they were in the wilderness, for 38 years that they were in the wilderness, 38 years and 10 months, because that's when they dedicated this temple and the cloud settled over it. So I can't even imagine actually seeing in something so visible God's presence. That had to be very encouraging to them to know that God was leading them. I can't even imagine being in that wilderness for 40 years. But there was no GPS system. It wasn't up to Moses where they went. From that day on, God's presence was literally visible to them. In the daytime, it was the cloud. By night, it was the fire. Moses and the Israelites didn't need a GPS system. God led the way. And there is no doubt about which direction they were supposed to go. And it will be about 480 years until Solomon will build the temple, the actual temple. So they are moving and transporting and basically following this tabernacle throughout the wilderness for that amount of time. You notice back in verse 15, it said, on the day the tabernacle, comma, the tent of the covenant law, comma. There are other names that are used for the tabernacle. Sometimes it's called just the tent of meeting, where we saw Moses go in prior to this. It's called here the tent of the covenant law, but those terms are all referring to the tabernacle. And just think about how reassuring it was to see God's presence there at the tabernacle. Now we're going to read verses 17 through 21. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Whenever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command, they encamped. As long as this cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. When the cloud when the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's command, and they would encamp. And then, at his command, they would set out. Sometimes the cloud stayed only from evening till morning, and then it lifted in the morning, and they set out. Whether by day or by night, whenever the cloud lifted, they set out. Verses 17 through 20. This is how God's GPS system worked. The cloud or the fire was present over the tabernacle, they stayed. If the cloud or the fire moved, they moved. It was just that simple. Sometimes the cloud or the fire was only stationary for a few days or even just overnight. But if God moved, they moved. Remember the Levites, they had been divided and they had been assigned those specific duties. They knew exactly how to disassemble and pack that entire tabernacle. As part of the offerings, like I said, the offerings had been brought, and they had carts and they had things like that. Those were used to move some of those items of the tabernacle, probably the curtains and things like that. So they were transporting the tabernacle. Every time the cloud or the fire moved, they had to disassemble, pack away, and transport this whole tabernacle. And it was large. It was lots of yards of curtains and rods and poles and layers of curtains. Some were in charge of the curtains, some in charge of the poles, some of literally the Holy of Holy articles. Each family, each person had their exact responsibility. And God had organized it to a point that it was a fine art. Some scholars believe that it probably only took just a matter of a few hours for them to either break down, pack away, or to build, rebuild, reassemble the tabernacle because of the way it was organized. So our last verses for today are chapter 9, verses 22 and 23. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days or a month or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out. But when it lifted, they would set out. At the Lord's command, they encamped, and at the Lord's command, they set out. They obeyed the Lord's order in accordance with his command through Moses. These verses reiterate the obedience to God's command and leadership. At least their obedience in the movement of the people throughout the wilderness for that 40 years. They didn't strike out on their own. They were definitely disobedient at times, but they did follow. They may have been grumbling, but they followed where the Lord led them, where he led them and when he led them. There was no schedule. Verse 22 tells us sometimes it was a couple of days, sometimes it was overnight, maybe a month, or maybe a year. But whatever the Lord commanded, they set out and they camped when and where the Lord commanded. Can you imagine being a Levite, wanting to get to the promised land? You're wanting to I would want the shortest route, and let's just get there. So I don't have to set up and disassemble this tabernacle so many times. But every time the cloud or the pillar of fire moved, you had to disassemble the tabernacle. And every time it stopped, you had to reassemble the tabernacle, and off you go again. Like I said, scholars believe that it probably only took a few hours to do that, but it still would be quite a chore. And just, can you imagine, only God could lead this 2 or 3 million people through the wilderness. So let's bring this lesson to a close. Only 70 people entered Egypt. That was 400 years ago. Only 70 people. There was Joseph's father, Jacob, his 11 brothers and their families. Now, as we exit and we're in the wilderness, the ones that were the census count of just the men that were fit for the army, age 20 and above, was 603,550. Plus, we have another 22,000 Levites, plus we have all of the women and children. So probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 million people exiting Egypt. Only God could organize and lead that group for 40 years in a desert wilderness. Their existence, their survival depended on following God. They could not get water from a rock. They could not create manna. They could not call in quail. Only God could do those things that were absolutely essential to their survival. We need to take from this lesson that we are just as dependent on God for our survival. We're just as much in a wilderness that we cannot control as the children of Israel were when they were in that wilderness. Our food supply, our water, our shelters, our weather, diseases. How arrogant we are to think that we have life under control. How arrogant we are to think that we deserve what we have. As disobedient and discontent as the Israelites were at times, throughout that 40 years, they did follow God where and when He led. We can certainly qualify on the disobedience and the discontentment. But where are we when it comes to following God for an extended amount of time? That's the question I want to leave with you at the end of this lesson today. Thank you.